you love spy books, movies, and TV, then the Spybrary podcast is for you.
Hello and welcome to episode 245 of the Spybrary podcast. Today we are joined by Ben Macintyre. Ben is a favorite of many of us here at Spybrary. He's the best-selling author of Agent Sonia, A Spy Among Friends, Double Cross, Operation Mincemeat, Agent Zigzag, Rogue Heroes, and Prisoners of the Castle. Ben joins us today to reveal more about his latest book, The Siege. Welcome to Spybrary, Ben.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Actually, it's your second appearance here because you were once interviewed by one of our intrepid reporters. It was a young whippersnapper called Tim Shipman who spoke to you about Prisoners of the Castle.
He cut his teeth on me. I like to think he really stepped up to the big league there, and I think he's very grateful to me. It's marvelous. He's also my colleague on the Sunday Times, so I know Tim pretty well. It was one of those interviews where we had to pretend we didn't really know each other, but that was great fun. I enjoyed that.
It really was, and an excellent book as well. And we're also joined today on the show. I've invited fellow Spybrarian Rossa McPhillips. Now, Rossa spent 10 years in the British Army Intelligence Corps, where he was awarded an MBE for things he can't tell us about. He spent 2 years with the Met in counterterrorism. He's now a scriptwriter, having written comics, radio drama, and even episodes of BBC Doctors. He says he would next like to write a TV adaptation of your book, The Spy and the Traitor, but suspects someone else may have beaten him to it. Welcome back, Rossa.
No, it's great to be here. It's an honor to be part of this interview with you, Ben. The book is a smasher, absolute smasher. I think I read it in about a day.
Very, very kind of you, Rossa. Well, it'd be fascinating to hear your insights on it, because you, as a counterterrorism person and someone who was in the Met, you will have thoughts on this that I would love to hear. It's a fascinating story. I mean, you're probably too young to remember it actually happening, but I remember it so vividly. I mean, it was an astonishing moment, and it did change British life in all sorts of highly significant ways.
So I wanted to read a quick blurb just to set the scene here. For those of you who may not be familiar with what happened in London in 1980, it's a story of ordinary men and women under immense pressure. The Siege takes readers minute by thrilling minute through an event that would echo across the next 2 decades and provide a direct historical link to the tragedy on 9/11. Drawing on exclusive interviews and a wealth of never-before-seen files, Macintyre brilliantly reconstructs a week in which every day minted a new hero and every second spelled the potential for doom. So, Ben, your books often delve deep into history and with a narrative drive that keeps us readers, on the edge of our seats. What initially drew you to the story of the Iranian Embassy siege for your latest book?
Always wanted to write this book. I think when I was 16 years old, and I was watching. It was a bank holiday Monday in London, and I was watching the snooker, believe it or not. Not a sport that necessarily means a huge amount to American listeners, but then it was very exciting, and it was coming to the final, and we were all, lounging around, and suddenly it cut live from the snooker to footage of men in balaclavas abseiling down the outside of the Iranian Embassy in London, throwing flashbang grenades in and storming inside with machine guns. Now, I had never seen anything exciting before. It was live news, the way that it had never been broadcast before. This was the very first time that all 3 channels, and believe it or not, we had 3 channels in Britain at that point, 3 of them were broadcasting this moment live. So, and I think for there were 14 million people watching the snooker, by the way, who had no choice but then to kind of watch what was happening. And I think it had a profound effect on me, as it did on many others. Many years later, I wrote an authorized history of the wartime SAS, and called Rogue Heroes. At that time, I asked the SAS whether it would be possible to have a similar form of access to write the Iranian Embassy siege story, because, not to cut too far ahead of the story, but the story ends with this incredibly dramatic assault on the building by the Special Forces team. And at that point, which was about 10 years ago, they said there is no way we are ever going to talk about this in public.
Wow.
To about 2 years ago, and I asked the same question. And to my astonishment, the Ministry of Defence gave formal permission for me to interview all the surviving yes, people who are involved. That's unprecedented. That's never happened before. And many of them had never spoken about the event before. One of the reasons I wanted to do this was because this episode has been heavily mythologized in British cultural life. Almost from the moment it happened, it became a kind of parable, if you know what I mean. It became an emblem of the Thatcherite approach towards terrorism. It became part of a kind of post-imperial British pride in our armed forces. It became, as I say, a kind of a black and white story of good and evil. Became a morality tale, if you like. Wicked terrorists beaten by daring members of the special forces. And of course, there's a lot to that. I mean, like all myths, there is an essence of truth in that. The real story of what happened during the embassy siege is both much more complicated and, I think, much more interesting than that simple cultural moral fable that we're often offered in terms of modern history. Often these things, because of the media and the way it works, and I'm a member of the media, so I'm complicit in this, we present simple answers to complicated questions. What I wanted to do was to try and tell that story from all the different vantage points of the different people involved, not just the hostages, but also the gunmen themselves, the police, the counterterrorism forces, the SAS, the politicians. All of these people had different perspectives on what was happening in this incredibly intense 6-day period. And I wanted to put a tell around a story, if I possibly could, that had been told before.
Yeah, I think we had a really interesting insight into, Salem, who his real name was Tawfiq al-Rashidi, I think. And, his background and really going into how the Shah had treated the people of Arabistan and then how the Ayatollahs had treated it afterwards. And we've not really got that perspective before. I don't think any medium, even the Peter Taylor documentary, even the recent 6 Days film, no one really gave any kind of oxygen to them. And I really, reading about all those guys and where they came from was gripping stuff.
Well, thank you,
Really
Rossa. I mean, it was a difficult balance. I mean, just to set the scene for your listeners, to give a bit of the sort of historical context of what this was really about. If you asked people in the street today what that conflict was about, what had happened inside that embassy, most people, I think, would say to you, oh, well, it was an attack on the Iranian embassy, so it was all about Islamic fundamentalism. It had to do, and of course, that really wasn't what it was about. The year before, 1979, the Islamic Revolution had taken place in Iran, ousting the Shah, replacing him with a hardline clerical regime under the Ayatollah Khomeini. Diplomats inside the Iranian embassy in London were representatives of the Ayatollah's regime. These were Islamic fundamentalist devotees for the most part. Not all of them, because those were the senior diplomats. There were also staff people there, Iranians, who were not really part of that regime. The reason why these 6 Arab gunmen targeted the Iranian embassy was to oppose the Ayatollah. They were looking for civil and political rights for the Arab minority in Iran. It's an incredibly obscure conflict. It still goes on today. You can imagine what the poor Met was doing when this story began to unfold, because none of them had ever heard of Khuzestan or the fact that there was a kind of complicated sort of factional battle going on there. Each of these 6 gunmen experienced really brutal oppression at the hands of the Ayatollah's security services. Leader, who you just mentioned, Rossa, Tawfiq al-Rashidi, his brother had been captured by the Iranian security service, tortured brutally, and then executed. Now, I don't want to make it sound as if these 6 gunmen were somehow heroes. They were not. They were men of violence. They were people who were prepared to kill, be killed. But like everybody in the world, they have their story. They have reasons. They may not be justifiable in our minds, and to me, they're not justifiable. But they are nonetheless, they are human beings, and they've really been written out of the story hitherto because they were on the wrong side of history. And boy, were they on the wrong side of history. So then it's a difficult balance because, as I say, history isn't made up of moral blacks and whites, but we do have to make judgments about it. looking back in the past, but we can make those on the basis of more information, I think, rather than less.
Yeah, like I said, I think going through the book and like discovering more about them, seeing how they actually interacted with the hostages and things was, was quite. There was a certain, like you said, about the different kind of syndromes, the Stockholm syndrome and Lima syndrome, and kind of towards kind of the bit, I did feel a lot for them because I knew where they'd come from. But I think, spoiler alert, but when they opened up on the hostages on the 6th day, I kind of thought, guys, opening up a rifle in a very small, crowded room, you kind of lost my sympathy totally. And I kind
Me
of was
too.
like,
Me too. And the way that was part of the journey I was trying to make both for myself and for the readers was it was hard not in a way to feel some kind of humane feeling for them. They were naive idiots, most of them. I mean, particularly the younger ones had no clue what they were doing, really.
Yeah.
They'd been dragged into this. They were political pawns in many ways, because, of course, again, what very few people realized is that the gunmen bankrolled and trained and organized by the Iraqi intelligence service. This was Saddam Hussein's way of getting at the Iranians. This was the precursor to the Iran-Iraq war. These guys they thought they were fighting for freedom. The truth is they were complete dupes. They were just being used. Now, that, again, it doesn't justify what they were doing. It does, to some extent, explain it. But I agree with you. The narrative, hope, ebbs and flows. And feelings that one has for the gunmen and the hostages at one moment can change throughout this period. It's a very dense and concentrated 6-day period. Because I-5 and the police had been able to insert listening devices into the building, is able to reconstruct almost minute by minute what is happening inside that building. And in a way, that's why I love the story, is it takes place in a very tight area. It all really takes place in one room over 6 days. And for me, trying to recreate that has been the real challenge of this. And it's been incredibly good fun, but also very emotionally quite difficult at times, because I was watching the relationships not just between the hostages and the gunmen, but among the hostages themselves, among the gunmen. They were also those relationships were beginning to fracture and change. There are another whole set of relationships that are taking place between the police negotiators, the outside, who are desperately trying to bring this thing to a bloodless conclusion. They too are beginning to feel a kind of sympathy for the gunmen, and they're in an impossible position because Michael Thatcher had really given them very little to negotiate with.
Yeah. Sorry, you can jump in a second, Shane.
No, go for it.
On that last point, did you feel that, from obviously looking up, stepping back and looking at it from a that kind of perspective, that vantage point, did you think the armed raid was kind of inevitable because Thatcher had given the police so little wiggle room?
Good question, and one that is almost impossible to answer, really, because getting into sort of what might have been history there. But in my view, and it's certainly the view of the wonderful psychiatrist, Professor John Gunn, who was brought in by the police to kind of assess the psychological developments as it was going on. It's his belief, and I share it. Had there been one more day of negotiations, had the police been able or allowed to string it out for another 24 hours, I think those exhausted, frustrated gunmen might simply have put down their weapons and walked out. I also think, and again, John Gunn agrees with me on this, one of the demands that was made by the gunmen was they simply wanted to have an Arab ambassador, a diplomat, to serve as a kind of interlocutor in the negotiations, because that was going to give them status. That is one of the things that Thatcher was very reluctant to do. She didn't want to allow that. She was certainly not going to let them fly away, which is what they wanted to do. And I suspect that if one Arab ambassador had simply been allowed to get on the telephone and say to Tawfiq al-Rashidi, "We hear you, but you've got to come out now, boys. This is over." It is my belief that we would never have had the Iranian embassy assault that happened.
Wow. Interesting, yeah.
I can certainly see the logic to do this. I mean, has to sort of slightly put oneself into her shoes too. She had been in power for less than a year. This was the most major crisis she had faced so far. There were terrible events taking place in Northern Ireland. The Troubles were reaching a crescendo. She felt she could not be seen to bend in any way to the demands of armed terrorists. It was a huge gamble on her part. Look, I mean, you can say what you all have very different views about Margaret Thatcher and her legacy and so on, but she took it was a bold move on her part. She had been told there were likely to be 40% casualties in that building, even if they went in with the plan that they had. Nonetheless, she said to go ahead. If the Iranian embassy siege had ended in a different way, I mean, if it had ended in a proper bloodbath, I think Thatcher's premiership would have been completely imperiled. I think she would have been in deep trouble. I think the SAS might well have been disbanded. I mean, there were threats to its continuity anyway. So, one has to sort of slightly look at it through her eyes as well. She felt she could not appear to be weak at that moment. And funnily enough, its success became the foundation stone, really, of the Iron Lady myth that was sort of, It's extraordinary that sort of ever afterwards, whenever Thatcher did something particularly kind of aggressive or tough, it would be pictured by cartoonists dressed in a balaclava helmet with a machine gun abseiling down the outside of Big Ben. It became the kind of leitmotif of her resolve and her toughness, and she knew how to run a PR campaign. I mean, she was forever being photographed with people in black balaclava suits and machine guns ever afterwards.
Yeah. Didn't she go to the barracks after the siege to have a beer, or the SAS men had a beer? I'm not sure if Mrs. Thatcher did.
Well,
but
we don't know we certainly know that Dennis did. I mean, Dennis and Thatcher appeared to jump way ahead, but after the successful conclusion of the assault, they all gathered again in Regent's Park Barracks and broke out the Foster's Lager. There are two very hilarious moments. One is when one of the soldiers noticed that not only Margaret Thatcher, but the Whitelaw had tears in their eyes as they were going around thanking the soldiers. It only later dawned on them the reason why they had tears in their eyes, or quite likely the reason they had tears in their eyes, was that the SAS soldiers were still covered in tear gas. So, in fact, what appeared to be high emotion on the part of senior officials in government was probably because they were being gassed, in fact. I mean, subsidiary. And there's a very good moment when they're watching themselves. They turn the televisions on in the barracks, and all the guys gather around to look at themselves on television for the first time. Margaret Thatcher, with her rather bouffant hair, moves in front of them. And someone at the back shouted, "Get the out of the way, whoever you are." And she sort of ducks out of the picture immediately. Nobody spoke to Margaret Thatcher that way, but it was one of those few occasions, yeah.
What was the response from the Iranian government to the attack?
The Iranian government initially decided that this must be a Western plot. Their first reaction was, this is a CIA-sponsored attack on Iranian officials, and we call on the British government to bring it to a swift conclusion. It stuck to that line, although they did modify it slightly. They pulled back a little from the idea that it was a Western plot, and calmer heads behind the scenes were saying to the British government, please bring this to an end. The wider story, which again one needs to bear in mind, is that at this very moment, at the same time as this siege was taking place, in Tehran, the American hostage crisis was underway. There were 55 hostages, Americans, being held in the US Embassy in Tehran. Inevitably, there was, even though the two events were in fact unconnected, there was a link being made, and the Americans were putting pressure on the British to say, look, if you can resolve this peacefully, if you can do a favor to the Iranians, that may be a lever which we can then use to get our guys, our hostages, out of Tehran. Of course, that was a misreading of the Iranian government, which was so hardline, it was never going to cooperate on anything. Indeed, at one point, the Iranian government threatened that Iranians in Britain themselves march on the embassy, on the Iranian embassy, and liberate the hostages themselves. There was at one point, and the police, while they played this down afterwards, were pretty rattled by the thought that thousands of extremely radical Iranian fundamentalists could come marching down Kensington, try to do it themselves. They put in place enough and enough preventative measures to make sure that didn't happen. But the whole thing has a kind of international dimension. Of course, when it was successfully resolved, Margaret Thatcher expected and hoped that the Iranian government would be extremely grateful and that would reopen the possibility of renewing relations with Tehran. Nothing of the sort happened. The Ayatollah was not going to just turn around and say, well, thank you very much, let's be friends again. It didn't happen that way.
Can they give us a bill for damages?
All for damages went on for 10 years. The fight over who should pay for what had been done to the half-burnt Iranian embassy was not resolved for a very long time.
Who ended up paying for it? Who ended up paying for it?
I think they went half.
Bill was split in the end. The bill was in a typical
They went
splendid diplomatic resolution. They finally worked out that each would pay for half of it.
Yeah. So I was just going to say that the relationship between Iran and the UK has always been a bit sort of out. Hasn't been great. You know, you have that Uncle Napoleon book where the lead character just blames everything on the British, you know, and it's an Iranian kind of book, and it was made into a soap where, you know, if he fell over a stone, the British put the stone there. So, you know, and you kind of, you know, you have obviously the Anglo-Soviet invasion during the Second World War. You have the coup in 1953. You know, and even recently, you know, obviously the UK took part in the defense of Israel when Iran attacked it. You know, they took part with the US and France. So I think the relationship has always been a bit frosty, no matter kind of who was in charge, and you can't really blame the Iranians for a lot of that. But I mean, obviously, I do blame, you know, that you can't quite, but I can understand where they're coming from because there has been that interference.
There has. I mean, historically, both Britain and America, and indeed the Soviet Union, have meddled in Iranian affairs and dabbled in Iranian oil, attempted to extract the natural resources of that country time immemorial. So there's a wonderful, even those opposed to the fundamentalist regime believe that actually in some way the British must have been behind the Ayatollah's rise to power. There's a saying in Farsi, which is, if you look under the Ayatollah's beard, you will find the British, believe it or not. I mean, it's sort of, so all sides, there is in fact a word in Farsi that means British spy. I mean, it is that specific that you know, that there is historically British are behind everything, which is very flattering and not entirely true.
Yeah.
It does have some basis in historical reality, absolutely. So initially the Iranian reaction to the siege was, this must be a plot. This must be an attempt to get back for the sieging of the American embassy in Tehran. I mean, it was assumed on all sides that there must be a link. And indeed, of course, one has to bear in mind that just 6 days before the embassy in London was attacked, Americans had tried to liberate their hostages in Tehran. Absolutely disastrous Operation Eagle Claw, which went totally, you know, cocked up completely with many deaths. That and actually ended up reinforcing the Ayatollah's hold on power and damaged the Carter administration in a way that it never recovered from. So hanging over politicians in Britain as they try to tackle this incredibly situation is the knowledge that if it goes wrong, they end up with another Eagle Claw, are going to end up reinforcing the Ayatollah's power. And that's, you know, they're in real danger.
You mentioned earlier about listening devices in the embassy. Who put those in there and how did they put them in there?
Well, it's one of the great stories, really, again, largely untold, right from the beginning. Not just the police technicians, but MI5 launched an all-out technical assault on that embassy. They began not only drilling audio probes in from, now these sound to us incredibly rustic these days, in the age when you can use an iPhone to do this stuff. In those days, this was cutting-edge technology. They were drilling in from each side of the embassy. They were also lowering listening devices down the chimneys. Food containers that were sent into the building contained radio-controlled listening devices. even the field telephone. So they cut off the telephones, they cut off the telex, but they did introduce a field telephone which was linked directly to the hostage negotiators, to the police. The gunmen never realized was that that too was a listening device that contained by far the most effective bug they had in the embassy. So one shouldn't exaggerate it. They didn't have a complete picture of what was being said in there, but they were picking up some really valuable intelligence. There's a moment, though, when, and this is one of those moments of comedy in a story that is otherwise terribly tragic in lots of ways. Human beings find comedy in the strangest places, and the terrific moment when sounds of drilling in the wall begin to alert the gunmen that something is going on, and they rush down to get Trevor Locke, who is the wonderful, placid, portly policeman who's been captured along with the other gunmen. And they drag him upstairs and say, Mr. Trevor, there is noise in the walls. They're going to attack us. Of course, Trevor Locke knows exactly what this is, but he, with great ceremony, takes off his peaked cap and he kneels down and he listens up to the wall and he says, I think we have mice. Totally implausible. But of course, here's the other thing. Those listening devices picked up the rising anxiety that this noise was causing. That it was really beginning to make the gunmen very jumpy. So first of all, they worked out that the way to cover a small noise is to make a very large noise. They contacted, believe it or not, the gas board and arranged for the gas board to begin digging an entirely unnecessary hole with pneumatic drills about 100 yards away from the embassy. So this was an attempt to cover the noise of the drilling to put in the audio probes. Actually, it had exactly the opposite effect. It created yet more tension inside the building. So they then did something absolutely unprecedented, which you'd never get away with today, which was that they contacted the Civil Aviation Authority and arranged for planes from Heathrow to fly low over the embassy, the belief that the noise, and it worked, would cover the noise of the drilling. So every time one of these planes was coming in, making this deafening noise, the drilling would start up again. And that as the plane moved away, they'd stop.
It's genius.
But can you imagine today, Rossa, saying to the Civil Aviation Authority, we'd like you to take 300 passengers illegally low over the centre of London because we're trying to cover drilling in the wall. It just wouldn't happen. Health and safety.
So, in terms of, you've spoken many times about intelligence and spying and how a lot of it actually doesn't lead. It may aid diplomacy, but doesn't actually lead to a huge thing. On rare occasions it might have done, like Bletchley Park and things. So that all that actionable intelligence, the intelligence that MI5 and the police were getting from those bugs, was that actionable for when the SES went in, or was it just good sort of atmospheric?
You've put your finger on one of the central conundra of intelligence work, which is that even at its best, it can be misleading. That is the problem with intelligence, is that we privilege it. I mean, we're getting slightly off the topic here, but we privilege secret intelligence because it is secret. But the fact that it is secret does not necessarily make it true or accurate. And that's, we've seen this in the Iraq War. We see it time and again where politicians believe something because it is presented to them as secret. Imagine that must be better. Now, and the Iranian Embassy siege is a case in point. Yes, the bugs, the infrared devices, all the other things they were using led them to believe they knew what was really happening inside the embassy. They believed, for example, when Tawfiq was on the field telephone, when he was talking to the policeman, he had to be in the front lobby. He had to be downstairs in the hall because the lead on the telephone was only so long. Well, completely wrong. He wasn't in the hallway. He'd managed to wind the lead up to the first floor. So central part of the plan was that they would blow up the atrium over the central hall, and that the girders and the glass would land on top of Tawfiq and give him, as Hector Gullen, the organizer, put it, a very close haircut. That didn't happen because their intelligence was wrong. In the same way, it's not the SAS's fault. It's not really anybody's fault. This is the way intelligence sometimes works. They believe the gunmen were holding the hostage in one room. They were wrong. They were not in that room. They were in a different room. They'd been moved. Tawfiq was no fool, and he was moving them around the embassy, and he'd already moved them. And it's an extraordinary thing. But if you look at I have one of these, the sort of plastic sheets that the SAS were issued with immediately before they went in. This was the most up-to-date intelligence they had, and it was a layout, a sort of floor plan of the inside of the embassy. And in one corner, there are stick figures presenting the hostages and the gunmen. There's one thing which rather wonderfully, there's a sort of stick figure on a chair, and it says "policeman in chair." Fine, except that it was wrong. It got the people in the wrong place. Now, in the end, he got away with it, and it's probably the wrong way to put it. They were very, very lucky. But intelligence cuts both ways. It can give you a false confidence.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think in my history, if you had a SIGINT report from GCHQ saying this is direct from someone's phone call, everyone kind of thought, well, it must be true then. But everybody lies on the phone. Everybody kind of, we say things, we lie to each other, So but you do have politicians and generals and so on kind of believing it verbatim. So yeah, no, that would be completely my experience of it. I suppose in the counterterrorism world, it's a bit more immediate, I suppose. When we were getting diplomatic stuff, you're like, well, that's great for information. But in a counterterrorism operation, when you're building up a picture of terrorists that will lead, hopefully, to an arrest, then you kind of feel the intelligence actually is of more use. But I think it can go wrong. You can get the wrong things. You can, sometimes somebody buying fertilizer is just buying fertilizer. But yeah,
that's absolutely right. In a way, I think the intelligence build-up that they did manage to do was very impressive. I mean, I've seen what the SAS were studying, and it's astonishingly accurate. Even the sort of photo fit pictures that they were drawing up of these gunmen are surprisingly good, given they didn't really have eyes on them. They were overhearing them a bit. They were getting snapshots of them at windows. It's a pretty remarkable achievement. I mean, that said, of course, it wasn't complete. There were people that they believed to be in the embassy who were never inside the embassy because actually they were still on holiday, believe it or not. They had never worked out where they were, and they assumed they were still inside. So, it's an art, intelligence, as you know, Ross. It's not a science.
Yes.
It's not something that has a sort of template that you can tick off the boxes and it's perfect. It's always a matter of imagination and opposition and your best bet based on whatever it is you can gather together. And often we forget that, I think. We assume that MI5 must be able to track down all legal operatives, and it doesn't work that way. It's not as simple as that.
Not as simple as that at all. Just going back to the SAS, and obviously kind of nobody really knew unless you were in the know in 1980 of who these guys were. And certainly a lot of people at the time probably thought it was police. But, after this, the SAS is kind of completely out there and completely famous and completely notorious and kind of obviously well respected. But then someone like, General Sir Michael Rose comes out and says, regrets I've had a few, so it's been a double-edged sword for them.
It really has, and I think it's fascinating. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Rossa. 99 out of 100 people in Britain would never have heard of the SAS in 1980. They were still a very shadowy, highly effective, but very, very secretive organisation. They were operating in Northern Ireland. They were operating in other places around the world. A certain controversy was already beginning to attach to them over the operations that they were doing in Northern Ireland. Really, people had never heard of them. And indeed, there were moves to say that they weren't effective enough and they should be disbanded. So that the SAS was sort of under threat. Overnight, I mean, within hours of this thing happening, the SAS became a household word. And being catapulted into the limelight like that, two immediate effects. One was that numbers applying to join the SAS rocketed. In Peter de la Billière is very funny about this. He was the Special Forces director at the time, and he said, overnight, young men were turning up at recruiting centres saying, give me a machine gun, give me a balaclava, I want to go and kill some terrorists. That's not how the SAS recruits. It doesn't work that way. The other effect was that foreign governments, realising that Britain had this capability, which again had been very secret. I mean, this has been hidden. The fact that Britain had a special projects team ready to go in, nobody really knew that. Other countries started trying to borrow it, trying to copy it. The SAS was sent abroad. So it was a really valuable calling card in many ways for the British military. On the other hand, Michael Rose is absolutely right. The old days when the SAS could operate with proper secrecy in a clandestine world were over. This moment onwards, right down to the present day, there is an enormous hunger to know what the SAS do and have done.
There is, and when I was in that kind of the army kind of world, I was in Hereford for attached, only attached now. I was never an operator myself. Attached to, and for the new guys, the new recruits that were coming into to SES, they would do like a battlefield tour. So they would get the guys, these new recruits would pass selection, and for like a day or 2 days, they'd go to Princess Gate, have one of the old guys, give them a little bit chat outside, to wake them all through the history, and then they'd probably go and get drunk and things. But it's kind of, yes, it was a double-edged sword, but kind of it's still a big recruiting thing.
But it's a great tension, isn't it, Rossa? I mean, I think ever since the SAS has had to wrestle with the twin pressures of wanting to remain secret, wanting to keep it under wraps, wanting not to blow their own trumpet, but at the same time being incredibly proud of what they do and maintaining the mystique of the regiment. So they are still caught slightly between the public side and the secret side, and they've never quite resolved it, I think, how to be very public, secret organization. You can't be a bit pregnant, and it's very hard to be a little bit public and highly secret at the same time. But I mean, all those, I don't particularly like them very much, but those kind of macho television programs about, who dares wins and who's the butchest here and, blah, blah, blah. That the sort of Ant Middleton stuff, that all to me is an almost direct descendant of this moment when the black-clad balaclava go into that building. And it gave a slight, again, I'll finish on this in a second, but it gave a slight misimpression in a way of what the SAS do. They don't just storm into buildings and kill people. They're a much more sophisticated organization than that. The breadth and depth of what they do, it's not just boy type heroics. They're not just a daring do group. They are in part an intelligence operation. They are partly a peacekeeping force. They're not quite this simple sort of boys' own paper smash and grab stuff.
Yeah, and I think, whatever about the publicity and whatever about, the secrecy of it, they are still the best we have. And they're still, when you meet them, as I'm sure you have, they are very impressive and very self-deprecating.
Incredibly modest. I think that's a really good point, Rossa. I mean, there's the old joke, isn't there, that if everybody who claimed to have been involved in the Iranian Embassy siege had actually been involved, the balcony on the front would have fallen off. The reality is that there were only 4 men on the front of that building. Only one of them is still alive. And one of the things that I've tried to do with this book is to make the point that actually this was an operation carried out by very few people. The numbers are really very, very small and dwindling. And I wanted to capture their memories while there was still time to do that. And even though the people I spoke to from the SAS had been given, in an unprecedented way, had been given authorization to speak to me by the Ministry of Defence, there was still a reticence among them who appear to be bragging about this, which is so different from the kind of tendency of the kind of, we're the tough guys. I was there at the embassy and so on. So, and even now, even then, some of them asked me to conceal their real identities. I have used on a few occasions in the book, at their request, they still do not want to be recognized in the street. They don't want to be told, well done, mate, we know you were one of them. But I've also faced a funny problem, which I don't know quite how I'm going to deal with it, which even before the book is out, I've been approached by a number of people saying, I think my Uncle Tommy was on the balcony, and I know he was involved because he told me about it, and he was brought by helicopter from Stafford. And I have to say, I don't absolutely right, because I've got the order of battle and Uncle Tommy's not on it.
Yeah.
It wasn't a flawless operation, was it, Nimrod? There was some didn't all go. Like the mythology is the SAS were perfect. They stormed in there almost like Where Eagles Dare, right? They took everybody out. But that wasn't the case. And that's what I learned from your book.
Yeah, that was a big
Well,
revelation.
I mean, most military operations are not flawless. I mean, it's, these are not, again, they're not simple things. As Hector Gullen, the guy who drew up Operation Nimrod, a wonderful, brilliant man, said to me, he said, no matter how much planning you do, he said, the other side is also planning. And you cannot be aware of every possible contingency. So, yes, things went wrong. I don't want to give away too much for your listeners, but
Yes.
things went wrong. It worked in the end, I would say, for three reasons. And worked broadly because bear in mind that 2 hostages were killed. All five of the 6 gunmen perished. That was not the plan. That they were supposed to be arrested. I mean, they didn't go in to kill gunmen. They went in to rescue the hostages. But nonetheless, there was considerable bloodshed. But the reason that it was the success that it was perceived to be, I think, was down to 3 things. One was training. I mean, the SAS had been training for a moment like this for 8 years. They had done every kind of hostage-taking situation except a real one. They'd done everything else. So they clicked in very quickly. The second was they were, as part of the training, able to adapt at astonishing speed to a different situation inside the embassy from the one they were expecting. And the third, I think, is luck, is pure good for. I mean, every single one of the people I interviewed did 2 things. One of them was that they paid tribute to their comrades. They all said it wasn't really me, it was Pete. They all did that. And they all said we were incredibly lucky. I mean, the bullets were flying everywhere. There were gas grenades going off. There was smoke everywhere. They didn't know who was a gunman and who was a hostage. As they were handing them down, there were still gunmen hiding among the hostages as they were being brought out. It was an unbelievably tricky and complicated situation. And amazingly, there was only one very minor injury among the SAS from one of the troopers who'd accidentally put his finger over the end of his gun and shot part of his finger off. That was it. That was the only kind of bloodshed on this side. But there were 2 hostages killed, and that has to be remembered.
Can I get a final question from you, Rossa, before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I suppose, obviously this is always excited to see what books you're writing, Ben. Obviously, I've read them all. But I suppose, what's next, I suppose, for you in terms of, if you can't tell us what next, maybe you can tell us if this is going to be more of a special ops military thing or whether it's going to be an espionage thing.
Next one is more of an espionage story, though it has a very important sort of special ops element to it. I can't say too much about it, except that it takes me into the Cold War. It's another intensely dramatic spy story. It's one that nobody outside the intelligence services knows about. And it's one of those stories that actually, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, do spies make a difference? This is one of those stories, although nobody really knows it, that has altered the world we live in. We live in a different, in a place that would be very, very different if this story, which involves an extraordinary escape as well in the middle of it, if that escape had not taken place, we might be living in a slightly different world today. So I'm very excited about it because it's partly a spy story, it's partly a kind of psychosexual drama, and it is of strategic importance to the way states interacted in the 80s.
Wow. Can you take my money now?
I'd like your money now. What I'd really like to do is start on the screenplay right now, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Brilliant.
You have a legion of fans at Spybrary, Ben, because you're able to write history in a way that I often pinch myself. Is this real? Is this really non-fiction? And, we talked about the low-flying aircraft, the drilling. You might read that in a spy novel and think, oh, as if. But then we read your book, it's like, no, this actually happened.
Yeah.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I love those moments when you think, and in a way that is the kind of the gold dust for a narrative non-fiction writer, is when you find a fact or an event or a moment that seems so outlandish and so unlikely, and yet it's true. and being able to tell those stories that really, that truth is stranger than fiction. It always is. I mean, truth is also, in my view, more interesting than fiction. But it's because it makes you pinch yourself, as you say, and think, really? I'm pretty rigorous about this, guys. I mean, I never make anything up. Because I think the minute you do that, the minute you start to fictionalize, your readers sense that that's what you're doing. So if I write, that morning in the embassy, it smelt of old stale bread and the mice, that's because I know that is the case. I've got evidence to do that. So I try to, and also the flip side of that is when you don't know what happens. And of course, these are true stories. So there are moments when you have no evidence, you don't know what happened. I think it's very important. I've always felt this, that you have to take the reader into your confidence and say, look, we don't know. We don't know what happened next. And I think that reinforces the reader's belief in you in some ways, because it makes right that when
Trust.
I do say, okay, the mice in the wainscoting or the the low flying aeroplanes, they say, right, okay, well, that is definitely true, and I'm delighted to say, and also I'm very lucky with this story in a way, because these were the 90s and people were still writing everything down in a way that they don't today. And I was so fortunate. I found 4 unpublished manuscripts written by people who'd been involved in the siege. One from the senior policeman, one from the senior SAS guy who'd kept a diary, and 2 from the hostages inside. These things had never been published, but they'd been written immediately, either during or immediately after the event. So they have a kind of credibility that I know as a historian I can rely on. And that is, I don't know how historians are going to write the history of our own times, because nobody does this anymore. Nobody writes it down in the same way.
I mean, when we print out top secret material, when I was that kind of, if you didn't shred that at the end of the day, a clerk would come after you, and just make sure you did. So all that stuff may be on a hard drive, but that is not being printed, and that's in the same way that it was.
I doubt it's even on a hard drive, because the lawyers go through this very closely, very quickly, and anything that's looking like it might be tricky somehow meets the shredder. Well, it doesn't even have to meet the shredder because you just press delete. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, for the future. Yeah.
I'm sure you must get pitched stories all the time. Have you ever considered the strange case of Otto Jürn?
No, tell me about that one. I don't know that one, Shane.
I'll email it to you, but basically he was involved in the July plot to assassinate Hitler, the German guy, obviously, in the resistance. And then he became head of the domestic intelligence of Germany. And next thing, in the 50s, he appears in East Berlin with the Soviets, gives a big press conference, I've defected. And then a few years later, he comes back and they arrest him and send him to prison. I'm like, what on earth has happened here? And Nigel West has written a bit about it. And I'm always like, this would be a great story for someone to write that.
Let's keep in touch. I love the sound of that one. I mean, I've always been fascinated by those post-war intelligence guys who so rapidly flip from one side to the other. The way that the CIA began mopping up the so-called Galen organization of the formerly Nazi operatives operating on the Eastern Front, because that was then of use to the West in their looming battle with the Soviets. That kind of way that my enemy's enemy becomes my friend so quickly is fascinating, I think.
Well, he wrote an autobiography and claims that he was kidnapped and drugged, and that's why. So anyway, I'll leave you to go and have a look at that.
Otto Jahn, actually, I do remember the name. He was the Yanka organization. I remember him. Yeah, no, he's a very dubious figure, and so is that memoir. I mean, like most spies not only love to tell their own stories, they love to make them up too, which is half the fun as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. I want to be respectful of your time, Ben. Before we let you go, can you share a bit more? I understand you're coming to the US on tour.
I'm doing a big US tour later this month. I'm in various different cities. I think it's still being nailed down, but I'm in DC, Tulsa, Dallas, LA. And then I'm also doing a Canadian tour as well on the way back. So I'll be doing, there are quite a few dates. And if people would like to come, they'd be so welcome. And you can find all of that on my website, the dates of everything and the venues and so on, and links to where to book them. So do please come.
Excellent. And that's benmacintyre.com. And I will add those links onto the show notes, which everyone can find at spybrary.com/245. Ben, thanks for your work. You've kept us all so entertained down the years. We love it when there's a new Macintyre in the bookshops available to buy. Please keep it up. It's
Well, you're
phenomenal.
very kind.
Yeah, please keep it up.
Shane and Rossa, it's been terrific to meet you both. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.